When a broken janitor asked a disabled billionaire's daughter to dance, neither knew this moment would shatter everything they thought they knew about love loss and second chances. In the cold marble lobby of Sterling Enterprises, where dreams go to die and hope costs more than most can afford, one man's simple question would ignite a firestorm that would expose dark secrets, challenge a corporate empire, and prove that sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't money. It's the courage to ask someone to dance. What happens next will leave you breathless. Stay with me until the very end and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Sterling Enterprises Tower pierced the Seattle skyline like a glass dagger, its 47 floors of gleaming steel and ambition casting shadows over the city below. At 11:47 p.m., the building was a monument to emptiness, every executive long gone to their penthouse apartments and weekend estates, leaving only the night shift to tend to the empire's bones. Ethan Crawford pushed his mop bucket down the marble corridor of the executive floor, the wheels squeaking a lonely rhythm against the polished stone. Each stroke of his mop was methodical, practiced the muscle memory of a man who had scrubbed away 3 years of his former life, one floor at a time. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made his weathered face look older than his 38 years. He paused at the massive portrait of Victoria Sterling that dominated the lobby, the Ice Queen herself, as the tabloids called her. Piercing blue eyes, platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe chignon, wearing a power suit that cost more than he made in 6 months. She was beautiful in the way that glaciers were beautiful, stunning, untouchable, and capable of destroying anything in their path. But it wasn't Victoria's portrait that made Ethan's chest tighten. It was the smaller frame beside it, a photo of her daughter Clara. 12 years old, with her mother's blonde hair, but softer features, sitting in a wheelchair, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The photo was from before the accident, before the darkness that had settled over the Sterling Empire like a shroud. Ethan had been working the night shift for 8 months, and he'd never seen the girl. Not once. The whispers among the day staff painted a picture of tragedy, a riding accident 18 months ago that had left Clara paralyzed, a mother consumed by guilt and rage, a child who had simply disappeared from the world. The elevator chimed, startling Ethan from his thoughts. At this hour, it should have been empty. The security guards were making their rounds on the lower floors, and the cleaning crew worked floor by floor. No one should be coming up to 47. The doors slid open with a whisper, revealing a sight that made Ethan's breath catch. A girl sat in a state-of-the-art wheelchair, her small hands gripping the controls with white knuckles. She wore a pale blue nightgown that seemed too big for her thin frame, and her blonde hair fell in tangles around a face that was hauntingly beautiful despite the hollow look in her eyes. This was Clara Sterling, but not the smiling child from the photograph. This was a ghost of that girl, a shadow wrapped in silk and sadness. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan stood frozen with his mop in hand, uncertain whether he was looking at reality or a vision born from too many lonely nights. Clara stared at him with the intensity of someone who had forgotten how to look at the world with anything but suspicion. "You're not supposed to be here," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the authority of someone raised in boardrooms and power lunches. Ethan set down his mop, his movements slow and non-threatening. "Neither are you, I'd guess." A flicker of something surprise amusement crossed her face before the mask of indifference slid back into place. "This is my mother's building. I can go anywhere I want." "That's true," Ethan agreed, crouching down so he was at her eye level. "But being able to do something and wanting to do it are different things. You don't look like someone who wants to be anywhere right now." Clara's hands tightened on her wheelchair controls. You don't know anything about me." "No," Ethan said gently. "I don't. But I know something about being in places you don't want to be, doing things that feel impossible, trying to find reasons to keep going when everything inside you says to stop." For a long moment, Clara studied his face with an intensity that was unsettling in someone so young. There were depths in her eyes that spoke of pain far beyond her years of nights spent staring at ceilings and wondering why the world had suddenly become such a cruel place. "Are you going to tell my mother I was here?" she asked. Ethan considered this. Victoria Sterling was his boss's boss's boss, a woman who could end his employment with a word, who moved through the world with the casual brutality of someone who had never had to question her own power. But looking at Clara, really looking at her, he saw something that made his chest ache with recognition. "That depends," he said. "Are you going to tell her I was here? You're supposed to be here. You're the janitor. And you're supposed to be in bed, I'd guess. So maybe we're both breaking rules tonight." The ghost of a smile touched Clara's lips, so brief he might have imagined it. "I couldn't sleep." "Bad dreams." "No dreams. That's worse." Ethan understood. He'd spent enough nights lying awake, afraid of the dreams that would come. Afraid of the memories that surfaced in the dark. Sometimes the absence of dreams was its own kind of hell. "What do you do," he asked, "when you can't sleep and you're stuck somewhere you don't want to be?" Clara shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey a universe of resignation. "Wait for morning. Count the hours. Try not to think." "That sounds lonely." "Everything's lonely." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd heard that same sentiment echoed in his own thoughts on countless nights, had felt the weight of isolation settle over him like a lead blanket. But hearing it from a 12-year-old girl, from someone who should have been worried about homework and friends and what to wear to school, was almost unbearable. Without thinking, without considering the consequences or the absolute insanity of what he was about to do, Ethan stood and extended his hand. "Would you like to dance with me?" Clara stared at him as if he'd suggested they fly to the moon. "What? Dance here in the lobby right now?" "I can't." She gestured at her wheelchair, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "I can't dance, I can't walk, I can't do anything." "Says who?" "Says the doctors, says physics, says reality." Ethan smiled, and for the first time in 3 years it felt genuine. "Well, the doctors aren't here, physics is overrated, and reality is what we make it. So I'll ask again, would you like to dance with me?" Clara's composure cracked just for a moment, and Ethan saw the 12-year-old girl beneath the armor of cynicism and pain. "You're insane." "Probably. But I'm also right here asking you to dance. And unless you have somewhere more important to be at midnight in an empty office building, I think you should say yes." For a heartbeat, Clara looked like she might cry. Then she looked like she might laugh. Finally, she looked like she might believe him. "Okay," she whispered. "Yes." Ethan moved to the janitor's cart and pulled out a portable radio, an ancient thing held together with duct tape and stubborn hope. He found a classical station, something soft and ethereal that seemed to transform the cold marble lobby into something magical. Then he did something that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. He picked up his mop, that symbol of his fallen status, his daily reminder of everything he'd lost, and began to dance with it. But this wasn't the clumsy, comical dancing of someone making fun of themselves. This was something else entirely. Ethan moved with a grace that spoke of years of training, of muscle memory that transcended his current circumstances. The mop became his partner, and he led it through steps that were fluid, elegant, heartbreakingly beautiful. Clara watched, transfixed, as this man, this janitor she'd never seen before, transformed the space around them. His movements told a story of loss and longing, of dreams deferred but not forgotten. Each step was a poem, each turn a prayer. And then he was beside her wheelchair, his hand extended again. "Your turn. I told you I can't. You can move your arms, can't you?" Clara nodded, uncertain. "Then you can dance." "Dancing isn't about legs, Clara. It's about feeling the music and letting it move through you. It's about being alive in a moment and deciding that moment matters." Slowly, hesitantly, Clara took his hand. Ethan began to move around her wheelchair, guiding her in a slow circle, his steps matching the rhythm of the music. And then, without thinking about it, Clara began to move to arms, following the melody, following his lead. They danced together in that marble lobby, a broken man and a wounded girl finding something neither had expected to find again. Clara's movements started small, tentative, but grew bolder as the music continued. She raised her arms above her head, her face tilted toward the ceiling, as if she could catch the notes that floated around them. For the first time in 18 months, Clara Sterling laughed. The sound was like glass breaking, like ice cracking, like the first bird singing after a long winter. It echoed off the marble walls and seemed to chase away shadows that had been lurking in corners for far too long. Ethan spun around her wheelchair, his own laughter mixing with hers, and for a moment, just one perfect, impossible moment, they were both free. Free from wheelchairs and mop buckets, from boardrooms and medical diagnoses, from the weight of expectations and the crushing burden of loss. They were just two people dancing in an empty lobby, creating something beautiful in a world that had forgotten how to be gentle. The music swelled, and Ethan lifted Clara's hands, helping her sway to the rhythm. Her eyes were bright with tears, but they were tears of joy, of recognition, of something that might have been hope. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the music. "Know what? That I needed this. That I needed to remember." "Remember what?" Clara looked at him with those two old eyes, but now there was something else there, a spark that hadn't been there before. "That I'm still here. That I'm still alive." Ethan's throat tightened. "We all need reminding sometimes." They danced until the song ended, until the silence settled around them like a blanket. Clara's cheeks were flushed, her breathing slightly labored, but she looked more alive than she had in months. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for saying yes." Clara tilted her head, studying him with that unnervingly perceptive gaze. "You're not really a janitor, are you?" Ethan's smile faltered. "I clean floors for a living. That makes me a janitor." "But you weren't always." It wasn't a question. Clara had recognized something in his movements, something that spoke of a different life, a different man. Ethan felt the familiar weight of his past, pressing down on him, threatening to crush the fragile joy of the moment. "No," he said quietly. "I wasn't always." "What were you?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment, this strange, broken, beautiful girl who had somehow seen through his carefully constructed armor in the span of a single dance. "I was someone who believed in magic," he said finally. "Someone who thought that movement could heal anything, that the right music could save anyone, that love was stronger than loss." What happened to that person? He lost everything that mattered. His wife, his daughter, his dance studio, his reason for believing in magic. Clara was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the gravity of someone far older than her years. "Do you miss him? That person you used to be?" Ethan felt something crack inside his chest, something, that had been frozen for 3 years beginning to thaw. Every day. Then maybe, Clara said softly, we can help each other remember who we used to be. Before Ethan could respond, the elevator chimed again. Both of them froze the spell of the moment broken by the harsh reality of their situation. Clara wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be talking to her, let alone dancing with her. And whoever was coming up to the 47th floor at nearly 1 in the morning was going to have questions that neither of them could answer. The elevator doors opened and Victoria Sterling stepped out. Even at this ungodly hour, she looked immaculate. Her platinum hair was still perfectly styled, her power suit unwrinkled, her makeup flawless. But there was something in her eyes, a wildness, a panic that spoke of a mother who had discovered her child missing and had torn the building apart to find her. Victoria's gaze swept the lobby, taking in the scene, her daughter in her nightgown, a janitor standing far too close, a radio playing soft music, 2 people who looked like they'd been caught doing something they shouldn't. Clara. Her voice was ice sharp enough to cut. What are you doing here? Clara's newly found lightness evaporated instantly, her shoulders hunching as she retreated into herself. I couldn't sleep. I just wanted... You wanted to leave your room without telling anyone. You wanted to scare me half to death. You wanted to... Victoria's eyes fixed on Ethan, and her expression turned predatory. And you? What exactly do you think you're doing with my daughter? Ethan straightened, meeting her gaze steadily. We were dancing. Dancing. Victoria said the word like it tasted bitter. My daughter is paralyzed. She doesn't dance. Your daughter is extraordinary, Ethan said quietly, and she dances beautifully. Something flickered across Victoria's face, surprise perhaps, or recognition, but it was gone so quickly that Ethan might have imagined it. Clara, we're leaving. Now. Victoria moved toward her daughter's wheelchair, her movements sharp and efficient. Mom, wait. Now, Clara. But as Victoria reached for the wheelchair handles, Clara did something she hadn't done in 18 months. She resisted. No. The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of a declaration of war. Victoria froze her hands suspended in the air. What did you say to... I said no. Clara's voice was stronger now, fed by something she'd forgotten she possessed. I don't want to leave yet. Clara Elizabeth Sterling, you will come with me this instant, or I will call security to what, arrest your own daughter for being in your own building. Victoria's composure cracked just slightly. You're not well, Clara. You're confused. This man... She gestured at Ethan like he was something unclean. This man is taking advantage of your condition. This man, Clara said, her voice gaining strength with each word, asked me to dance. And for the first time in a 1.5 years, I felt like a person instead of a problem. Victoria's face went white. Clara, you don't understand. I understand that I've been locked away like some shameful secret while you pretend I don't exist. I understand that you're so busy running your empire that you forgot you have a daughter who's still alive. And I understand that this man... Clara looked at Ethan, her eyes blazing with newfound defiance. This man saw me as something more than broken. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stood frozen, her daughter's words hitting her like physical blows. Ethan watched the interplay between mother and daughter, seeing layers of pain and misunderstanding that ran deeper than any corporate merger or hostile takeover. Finally, Victoria found her voice. Mr. Crawford. Ethan Crawford. Mr. Crawford, you are terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Mom, no! Clara's protest echoed off the marble walls. "And if I ever see you near my daughter again," Victoria continued, her voice deadly quiet, "I will destroy you, completely. Do you understand me?" Ethan looked at Clara, seeing the tears streaming down her face, seeing the light in her eyes flickering and threatening to go out entirely. Then he looked at Victoria, seeing a mother consumed by fear and grief, striking out at anything that threatened her carefully constructed walls. "I understand," he said quietly, "but I want you to know something, Mrs. Sterling. Your daughter isn't broken. She's not a problem to be solved or a shame to be hidden. She's a remarkable young woman who deserves to dance, to laugh, to be seen for who she is rather than what happened to her." Victoria's jaw tightened. "How dare you?" She's been waiting for someone to ask her to dance. Ethan continued, his voice gentle but unyielding. And tonight, for just a few minutes, she remembered what it felt like to be alive. Maybe you should ask yourself why a stranger had to be the one to give her that gift. With that, Ethan gathered his cleaning supplies, his movements careful and deliberate. He paused beside Clara's wheelchair, crouching down one last time. "Remember what we talked about," he said softly. "About who you used to be. She's still in there, Clara. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Clara reached out and touched his hand, her fingers small and cold. "Will I see you again?" Ethan's heart broke a little more. "I don't know. But I want you to know that dancing with you tonight was the most beautiful thing that's happened to me in 3 years. Thank you for reminding me that magic is still possible." He stood nodded once to Victoria, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, and walked toward the elevator. As the doors closed behind him, he heard Clara's voice, strong and clear. "Mom, we need to talk." The elevator descended toward the ground floor, carrying Ethan away from the sterile luxury of the Sterling Empire and back toward his small apartment, his empty life, his carefully maintained numbness. But something had changed in that marble lobby. Something had cracked open in his chest, and he wasn't sure he could seal it up again. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text message. He pulled it out, expecting to see a message from building security, or perhaps his supervisor delivering the official word of his termination. Instead, he saw a message from an unknown number. "Thank you for tonight. For the first time in forever, I feel like myself again. Clara." Ethan stared at the screen, wondering how she'd gotten his number, wondering what this meant, wondering if Victoria Sterling was already tracing the message and preparing to make good on her threat to destroy him. But as he stepped out into the cool Seattle night, he found that he didn't care. For one perfect hour, he had danced with a girl who needed to remember she was still alive. And in doing so, he had remembered something about himself, something he thought had died with his family in that fire 3 years ago. Hope was a dangerous thing. It made you vulnerable, made you believe in possibilities that could break your heart. But as Ethan walked through the empty streets, Clara's laughter still echoing in his memory, he found himself hoping anyway. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Victoria Sterling would make good on her threats, and his carefully reconstructed life would probably crumble around him. But tonight he had danced with magic in a marble lobby, and magic once awakened was notoriously difficult to put back to sleep. Above him in the Sterling Tower, lights burned in the penthouse offices as a mother and daughter faced each other across a chasm of grief and misunderstanding. And somewhere in the space between them, a question hung in the air, like music waiting to be heard. What happens when the things we've lost find their way back to us? What happens when a single moment of connection threatens to topple empires built on isolation and control? What happens when someone asks us to dance and we find the courage to say yes in the marble lobby of Sterling Enterprises. Those questions had been asked. Now, in the harsh light of morning, they would demand answers. And Victoria Sterling, billionaire empire builder, mother of a girl who had just remembered how to laugh, would have to decide whether she was brave enough to dance with the chaos that love and hope inevitably bring. The music had stopped, but the dance was just beginning. The elevator doors had barely closed when Victoria felt the weight of her daughter's words settle over her like a physical presence. Clara sat in her wheelchair in the center of the marble lobby, no longer the fragile ghost who had haunted the penthouse for 18 months, but something else entirely, something that reminded Victoria uncomfortably of herself at that age, all fire and determination wrapped in silk and steel. "Mom, we need to talk," Clara had said, and those 5 words carried more authority than most of Victoria's board meetings. Victoria turned slowly, her Louboutin heels clicking against the marble with the precision of a metronome. She had built an empire on her ability to read people, to identify their weaknesses, and exploit them with surgical precision. But looking at her daughter now, really looking at her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. "Clara, it's nearly 2 in the morning. You should be in bed, not what? Not laughing, not feeling human." Clara's voice carried a new edge, something sharp and uncompromising that Victoria recognized with a mixture of pride and terror. "Not remembering what it feels like to be alive." Victoria's composure wavered. She had spent 18 months carefully constructing a world where Clara's accident was manageable. Containable, something that could be solved with the right doctors, the right equipment, the right amount of money thrown at the problem. But the girl sitting before her, now eyes blazing with something that looked dangerously like hope, was threatening to demolish that carefully ordered universe. "You don't understand the complexities of your situation," Victoria said, falling back on the clinical language that had become her armor. "That man, that janitor, he has no training, no understanding of your medical needs. He could have hurt you." Clara laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "Hurt me, Mom. I've been dying in that room for a year and a half. Tonight was the first time I remembered what it felt like to be human." "You're being dramatic." "Am I?" Clara's hands gripped her wheelchair controls so tightly her knuckles were white. "When was the last time you looked at me, really looked at me, and saw your daughter instead of a liability to be managed?" The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Because the truth was, she couldn't remember. Somewhere between the accident and the endless parade of specialists between the board meetings and the hostile takeover attempts, between the guilt that ate at her every waking moment and the terror that kept her awake at night, she had stopped seeing Clara as her daughter and started seeing her as another problem to be solved. "I see you every day," Victoria said finally, but the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "No, you see a patient. You see a reminder of your failure. You see everything you couldn't protect." Clara's voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. "But that man Ethan, he saw me. Just me. Not the wheelchair, not the accident, not the tragic billionaire's daughter. He saw a girl who wanted to dance." Victoria felt something crack inside her chest, something she had sealed off the day she got the call about Clara's accident. "Dancing isn't going to heal your spine, Clara. It's not going to bring back the feeling in your legs. It's not going to. It brought back the feeling in my heart." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 18 months of unspoken grief and carefully suppressed hope. Victoria stared at her daughter, seeing for the first time the woman Clara was becoming, despite everything: brilliant, fierce, uncompromising, just like her mother. "Clara," Victoria's voice was barely a whisper, "I know you blame yourself." Clara said, her voice gentler now, but no less determined. I know you think if you'd been a better mother, if you'd said no to that writing lesson, if you'd been there instead of in Hong Kong closing the Morrison deal. Stop! Victoria's voice was sharp, desperate. But what happened to me isn't your fault, and keeping me locked away like some shameful secret isn't protecting me. It's killing both of us. Victoria sank into one of the leather chairs that dotted the lobby, her perfect posture finally cracking. For a moment, she looked less like a corporate titan and more like what she really was, a mother who had lost her way in the maze of her own guilt and fear. You don't understand, Victoria said, her voice hollow. The board is watching everything I do. The shareholders are questioning my judgment. There are rumors that I'm distracted, that I've lost my edge. If they think my personal life is affecting my ability to lead, then let them think it. Clara rolled her wheelchair closer, her eyes blazing with determination. You built this empire, Mom. You turned a failing tech startup into a Fortune 500 company. You've survived 3 hostile takeover attempts and came out stronger each time. Are you really going to let a bunch of old men in suits convince you that loving your daughter makes you weak? Victoria looked up at Clara, seeing not the broken child she had been protecting, but the fierce young woman she was becoming. When did you become so wise? When I had 18 months to think about what really matters. Clara reached out and took her mother's hand, her touch gentle but insistent. That man tonight, Ethan, he lost everything too. I could see it in the way he moved, in the way he talked about believing in magic. He understands what it's like to have your world collapse and have to figure out how to keep breathing. Victoria's throat tightened. Clara, you can't just trust everyone who shows you kindness. The world is more complicated than... I'm not a child anymore, Mom. Clara's voice was steady, sure. The accident took away a lot of things, but it didn't take away my brain. I know the difference between kindness and manipulation, and I know the difference between someone who sees me as broken and someone who sees me as whole. Victoria studied her daughter's face, seeing depths there that she had somehow missed. When had Clara grown up? When had she stopped being the carefree child who lived for horse shows and sleepovers and started being this poised, perceptive young woman who could see through her mother's defenses with surgical precision? What do you want from me? Victoria asked finally. I want you to bring him back. Clara, that's impossible. I fired him. I threatened him. And even if I could, you're Victoria Sterling. You own half of Seattle and have senators on speed dial. Are you telling me you can't find one janitor and convince him to come back? Victoria almost smiled despite herself. Clara had inherited more than just her mother's looks. She had inherited her strategic mind, her ability to cut through excuses and get to the heart of what needed to be done. And why exactly should I do this? Why should I risk my reputation, my position, for a man I know nothing about? Clara's expression softened, and for a moment she looked like the 12-year-old girl she still was underneath all that fierce determination. Because he made me remember who I am. And maybe he can help you remember who you are too. Before Victoria could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent message. She glanced at the screen and felt her blood pressure spike. It was from James Corbett, her chief financial officer, and the man who had been quietly building support for a coup against her leadership for the past 6 months. Emergency board meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. We need to discuss your recent distractions. Victoria stared at the message, feeling the familiar surge of anger and determination that had carried her through 2 decades of corporate warfare. Corbett had been waiting for any sign of weakness, any crack in her armor that he could exploit. And somehow he had learned about tonight. Mom, what's wrong? Victoria looked up to find Clara watching her with concern, and something shifted in her chest. For 18 months, she had been so focused on protecting Clara from the world that she had forgotten to protect herself from the vultures circling her empire. She had been so busy being afraid that she had forgotten how to fight. "James Corbett is making his move," Victoria said, her voice taking on the cold precision that had made her legendary in boardrooms across the country. "He's calling an emergency board meeting. He thinks tonight makes me look weak, distracted." Clara's eyes narrowed, and Victoria saw a flash of the ruthless intelligence that was her birthright. "Then we prove him wrong. I'm a Sterling mom. This is my legacy too." Clara straightened in her wheelchair, and suddenly she looked every inch a future CEO. "What do you need me to do?" Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in months, pride in her daughter, that had nothing to do with managing her condition and everything to do with the extraordinary woman she was becoming. "First, we need to find Ethan Crawford. Everything about him, his background, his history, why a man who dances like a professional is working as a janitor." Victoria's mind was already racing, calculating angles and strategies. "If we're going to bring him back, I need to know exactly who I'm dealing with." "I can help with that," Clara said. "I have his phone number." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "How?" "I may be in a wheelchair, but I'm still a Sterling. I have my ways." Despite everything, Victoria found herself fighting a smile. "What else do you know about him?" "He said he lost his wife and daughter. He had a dance studio. He believed in magic until he lost everything that mattered." Clara's voice grew soft. "He understands what it's like to have your whole world change in an instant." Victoria absorbed this information, her strategic mind already working through the implications. A man with that kind of loss would be either completely broken or forged into something stronger. The way he had stood up to her tonight, the way he had defended Clara without regard for his own safety, that suggested the latter. "There's something else," Clara said hesitantly. "When he danced, Mom, I've never seen anything like it. He moved like music made flesh. Whatever he used to be, he was extraordinary at it." Victoria's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her head of security. "Mrs. Sterling, we have footage of the incident with your daughter and the janitor. Mr. Corbett has requested a copy." The pieces clicked into place with crystalline clarity. Corbett hadn't just learned about tonight, he had orchestrated it. He had been watching, waiting for any sign of vulnerability, and now he thought he had found it. "He's been having me watched," Victoria said, her voice deadly quiet. "Corbett, he has security footage of tonight." Clara's face hardened. "Then we make sure he regrets it." Victoria looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the broken child she had been protecting, but a worthy heir to the Sterling Empire. Clara had inherited her mother's intelligence, her determination, and most importantly, her absolute refusal to back down from a fight. "The board meeting is at 8, Victoria said, her mind already formulating a plan. "That gives us 6 hours to turn what Corbett thinks is my greatest weakness into my greatest strength." "How?" Victoria smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "By giving them a story they'll never forget. By showing them that the woman who built this empire isn't distracted, she's evolved. She's fighting for something bigger than profit margins and stock prices. She's fighting for the future." Clara leaned forward, her eyes bright with anticipation. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to be brave. Braver than you've ever been in your life." Victoria reached out and took her daughter's hands, feeling the strength in them despite everything. "I need you to come to that board meeting with me. I need you to face down a room full of powerful men who see you as a liability and show them exactly who Clara Sterling really is." For a moment, Clara looked uncertain, and Victoria saw a flash of the frightened child she had been since the accident. But then her chin lifted, and her shoulders squared, and Victoria saw the future CEO she was destined to become. And Ethan, we find him, we bring him back, and we show the board that sometimes the most strategic thing a leader can do is remember what it means to be human. Victoria stood. Her decision made her path clear for the first time in months. But first, we need to have a conversation with Mr. Crawford, because if he's going to be part of this fight, he needs to understand exactly what he's walking into. Clara pulled out her phone and scrolled to Ethan's number. Should I call him? No, Victoria said, her smile turning predatory. We're going to pay him a visit. After all, the best negotiations happen face to face. As they made their way toward the elevator, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced since before Clara's accident: the thrill of the hunt, the electric anticipation of a battle worth fighting. For 18 months, she had been playing defense, protecting and hiding and managing damage. But the daughter who had just reminded her what courage looked like had also reminded her of something else. Clara Sterling hadn't become one of the most powerful women in America by playing it safe. She had built her empire by taking risks, by betting everything on herself, when everyone else said she would fail. And now, with her daughter by her side and a janitor who danced like an angel waiting somewhere in the Seattle night, she was about to place the biggest bet of her life. The elevator carried them down toward the garage, toward the confrontation that would either save the Sterling Empire or destroy it completely. And in the reflection of the polished steel doors, Victoria saw two women who looked ready for war. The music had stopped in the marble lobby, but the dance was just beginning, and Victoria Sterling was about to show the world that she had never forgotten how to lead. At 2:47 a.m., Ethan Crawford sat on the edge of his narrow bed in the studio apartment that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. The space was sparse, functional, a far cry from the Victorian house in Capitol Hill, where he had once lived with Sarah and Emma, where laughter had echoed through rooms filled with dance trophies and family photos, where love had been as natural as breathing. His phone lay on the nightstand, Clara's message still glowing on the screen like a beacon in the darkness. Thank you for tonight. For the first time in forever, I feel like myself again. He had read it 17 times, each time feeling something shift inside his chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. The knock on his door came soft but insistent, cutting through the silence like a blade. Ethan frowned, glancing at the clock. Nobody visited him at this hour. Nobody visited him at any hour. For 3 years, he had existed in carefully maintained isolation, avoiding connections that might remind him of everything he had lost. When he opened the door, Victoria Sterling stood in the hallway like an apparition of power and purpose. She had changed from her corporate armor into dark jeans and a cashmere sweater, but she still radiated the kind of authority that made lesser mortals step aside. Behind her, Clara sat in her wheelchair, wrapped in a soft blanket, her eyes bright with determination despite the late hour. "Mr. Crawford," Victoria said, her voice carrying none of the ice from their earlier encounter. "We need to talk." Ethan stepped back, gesturing them into his sparse living space. Victoria's eyes swept the apartment, with the calculating gaze of someone who missed nothing. The single bed, the kitchenette that looked barely used, the complete absence of personal touches that might suggest a life being lived rather than simply endured. "This is where you live?" Clara asked, her voice soft with something that might have been sympathy. "It suits my needs," Ethan replied, closing the door behind them. He turned to face Victoria, his shoulders squared despite the surreal nature of having a billionaire CEO in his apartment at 3 in the morning. "I assume this isn't a social call." Victoria settled into the room's only chair, with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to commanding any space she entered. My daughter seems to think you're important. Your daughter is extraordinary, but I imagine you already know that. What I know, Victoria said, her voice taking on the sharp edge that had intimidated boardrooms full of powerful men, is that you're not who you appear to be. Janitors don't dance the way you danced tonight. They don't speak with your vocabulary or carry themselves with your bearing. So who are you really, Mr. Crawford? Ethan met her gaze steadily, recognizing the interrogation for what it was. Clara Sterling was protecting her daughter, the only way she knew how, by gathering intelligence, by identifying threats, by maintaining control over every variable in the equation. I was a choreographer, he said simply. I owned a dance studio in Capitol Hill. I taught everyone from Broadway hopefuls to society wives, from children taking their first steps to elderly couples celebrating 50 years of marriage. I believed that movement could heal anything, that the right music could save anyone. And now you're a janitor, Victoria observed. That's quite a fall from grace. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. Sometimes falling is the only way to survive the landing. Clara leaned forward in her wheelchair, her eyes intense. What happened to your family? Victoria shot her daughter a sharp look, but Clara ignored it, focusing entirely on Ethan with the unwavering attention that was her birthright as a Sterling. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, feeling the familiar weight of grief settle over him like a shroud. He had spoken about Sarah and Emma to exactly 3 people in 3 years: his grief counselor, his lawyer, and the detective who had investigated the fire. But something about Clara's direct gaze, her refusal to look away from difficult truths, made him want to answer. There was a fire, he said finally. An electrical fault in the old wiring of our house. Sarah and Emma were trapped on the 2nd floor, while I was at the studio teaching a late class to a couple celebrating their anniversary. By the time I got home, he stopped, the words catching in his throat like broken glass. They found them together in Emma's room. Sarah had been trying to protect her. The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding of loss, of the way grief could reshape a person's entire existence. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and even Victoria's expression softened fractionally. How old was Emma? Clara asked quietly. 12. Just turned 12 the week before. Ethan's voice broke slightly. She was going to audition for the Seattle Youth Ballet in the spring. She had been practicing this piece by Debussy, Clair de Lune. She danced to it every night before bed in her pajamas, spinning around her room like she was made of starlight. Clara's breath caught. Like me. She was like me. Yes, Ethan said, looking at her with something approaching wonder. Exactly like you. Fierce and brilliant and completely unafraid of the world. When I saw you tonight, when you started to move to the music, for a moment I could almost believe in magic again. Victoria watched this exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't some random janitor who had taken advantage of her daughter's vulnerability. This was a man who recognized something in Clara because he had lost someone just like her. This was a father whose world had collapsed just as hers had threatened to do 18 months ago. The studio, Victoria asked. What happened to it? I sold it. Gave away everything that reminded me of them, of who I used to be. I thought if I could make myself small enough, if I could disappear completely, maybe the pain would disappear too. Ethan's smile was bitter. It doesn't work that way, of course. But by the time I realized that I had already destroyed everything I had built. Yet you still remember how to dance, Clara observed. You still carry it with you. Muscle memory, Ethan said. Some things are too deeply embedded to erase completely. Victoria studied him with new eyes, seeing not a threat to her daughter's safety, but something else entirely, a mirror of her own grief, her own desperate attempts to control an uncontrollable world. The realization was unsettling in its completeness. "Mr. Crawford," she said finally, "I have a proposition for you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "In 5 hours, I have to face down a boardroom full of men who think that caring about my daughter makes me weak. They have security footage of tonight, and they're going to use it to argue that I'm no longer fit to lead my own company. And you want me to help you prove them wrong. I want you to help Clara prove them wrong." Victoria's voice took on a new intensity. "My daughter has been hiding in shadows for 18 months, convinced that her accident made her less than she was. Tonight you reminded her that she's still extraordinary. I want you to keep reminding her." Clara's eyes widened. "Mom, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe it's time to stop protecting you from the world and start showing the world who you really are." Victoria turned back to Ethan. "I'm offering you a position, not as a janitor, but as Clara's movement therapist. Full salary benefits and complete creative control over her program." Ethan stared at her, certain he had misheard. "You're offering me a job. 5 hours ago, you threatened to destroy me." 5 hours ago, I was a mother protecting her child from what I thought was a threat. Now I'm a CEO recognizing talent when I see it." Victoria's smile was sharp, calculating. "Also, I've done my research. Ethan Crawford, former principal dancer with Pacific Northwest Ballet, owner of Crawford Movement Studio, which trained 3 dancers who went on to principal positions with major companies. Choreographer of Remembrance, which premiered at Lincoln Center and was called transformative by the New York Times." Clara gasped. "You were famous." "I was good at what I did," Ethan corrected quietly. "Before I forgot how to believe in anything." "Then maybe it's time to remember," Victoria said. "Because Clara needs someone who understands that healing isn't just about medicine and physical therapy. She needs someone who knows that sometimes the soul has to dance before the body can follow." Ethan looked between mother and daughter, seeing the desperate hope in Clara's eyes, the calculated risk in Victoria's. They were offering him more than a job. They were offering him a chance to matter again, to use his gifts for something other than his own survival. "What about the board meeting?" he asked. "You'll be there," Victoria said, with the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle that truly mattered. "As Clara's therapist, as evidence that I make strategic decisions based on what's best for my family and my company. They'll tear me apart. My background, the fire, the reasons I left my old life, it will all come out." "Let it," Clara said fiercely. "Let them see who you really are. Let them see that extraordinary people come from extraordinary pain, and that sometimes the best way to heal is to help someone else remember how to fly." Ethan felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen for 3 years beginning to thaw. These 2 women, so different, yet so alike in their fierce determination, were offering him more than employment. They were offering him redemption. "There's something else you should know," Victoria said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "James Corbett, my CFO, is the one behind tonight's ambush. He's been planning a coup for months, waiting for any sign of weakness. He thinks my love for Clara makes me vulnerable." "Doesn't it?" Ethan asked quietly. Victoria's smile was dangerous. "Mr. Crawford, I built a billion-dollar empire while raising a daughter as a single mother. I've survived 3 hostile takeover attempts, a scandal that nearly destroyed my reputation, and 18 months of watching my child disappear before my eyes. Love doesn't make me weak. It makes me unstoppable." Clara reached out and took her mother's hand. We're going to show them, aren't we? We're going to show them all. Yes, Victoria said, squeezing her daughter's fingers. We are. Ethan looked at them, this unlikely alliance of wounded warriors preparing for battle, and felt something he hadn't experienced since the night his world burned down. Purpose. Not just the hollow satisfaction of survival, but the electric anticipation of a fight worth winning. If I do this, he said slowly, if I walk into that boardroom with you, there's no going back. My past will become public knowledge. The press will dig into everything. The fire, my mental health, why a former principal dancer ended up mopping floors. Let them dig, Victoria said coldly. By the time I'm done spinning this story, you won't be the broken man who lost everything. You'll be the phoenix who rose from the ashes to give a disabled girl her wings back. Clara's eyes blazed with admiration for her mother's strategic mind. You're going to turn Corbett's weapon against him. I'm going to turn his weapon into our victory. Victoria stood, her movements crisp and decisive. The board meeting is at 8. That gives us 4 hours to prepare. Mr. Crawford, I need you to work with Clara to show all of us what's possible when someone believes in magic again. Ethan looked at Clara, seeing the hope shining in her eyes like starlight. What did you have in mind? I want to see her dance, Victoria said simply. Really dance. Not just moving her arms to music, but using everything she has to create something beautiful. I want to walk into that boardroom with video evidence that my daughter isn't broken. She's transcendent. Clara's face lit up with an expression Ethan recognized from 1,000 12-year-old dancers he had taught, pure, undiluted joy at the prospect of moving to music, of expressing something too big for words. Can we do it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Can we really dance? Ethan knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her hands in his. Clara, I've seen prima ballerinas who moved with less grace than you showed in that lobby tonight. The question isn't whether we can dance, it's whether you're brave enough to let the world see what I already know. What's that? That you're not disabled. You're differently abled. And sometimes different is exactly what the world needs to remember what beauty really looks like. Victoria pulled out her phone, her fingers flying over the screen, with the efficiency of someone who had built an empire on her ability to make impossible things happen. I'm calling my driver. We're going to Sterling Tower to the executive gym. It has mirrors, space, and the kind of sound system that can make angels weep. At 4 a.m, Ethan asked. Mr. Crawford, when you're fighting for everything that matters, 4 a.m. is just another hour on the clock. Victoria's smile was fierce, predatory. Besides, I own the building. I can use it whenever I damn well please. As they prepared to leave his apartment, Ethan felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumbling. For 3 years, he had hidden from the world, convinced that his gifts had died with his family. But Clara Sterling, this extraordinary girl who refused to let tragedy define her, was about to remind him of something he had forgotten. Magic wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about having all the right circumstances or all the pieces in place. Magic was about finding beauty in brokenness, about creating light in darkness, about refusing to let loss have the final word. And as they made their way toward the Sterling Tower, toward the confrontation that would either save their family or destroy it, Ethan felt something stirring in his chest that he had thought was gone forever. The music was starting again, and this time he was ready to dance. In the executive gym, 30 floors above Seattle, surrounded by mirrors that would reflect every movement, every triumph, every moment of transcendence. A former principal dancer was about to teach a billionaire's daughter that some things were stronger than spinal cord injuries, stronger than corporate politics, stronger than fear itself. Love. Music. the unbreakable human spirit that refused to stay down no matter how hard the world tried to keep it there. The board meeting was in 4 hours. The battle for the Sterling Empire was about to begin, and in a room full of mirrors and possibility magic was about to remember how to fly. The executive gym on the 32nd floor of Sterling Tower had been designed as a monument to corporate wellness, floor-to-ceiling mirrors, state-of-the-art equipment, and a sound system that could fill Carnegie Hall. At 4:30 a.m., it was empty, except for the 3 unlikely allies who had come to wage war against impossibility itself. Victoria watched from the sidelines as Ethan moved through the space with the fluid precision of someone returning to hallowed ground. His fingers traced along the mirrored walls, testing acoustics, assessing angles, transforming the sterile corporate fitness center into something that might serve as a stage for miracles. Clara sat in her wheelchair at the center of the room, her reflection multiplied infinitely in the surrounding mirrors. For the first time since the accident, she was seeing herself not as a patient or a victim, but as a dancer preparing for the performance of her life. "The mirrors are going to be your greatest ally and your greatest challenge," Ethan said, crouching beside her wheelchair. "They'll show you every movement, every emotion, every moment of beauty you create. But they'll also show you your limitations, your fears, your doubts. The question is, which reflection will you choose to believe?" Clara studied her face in the glass, seeing the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming reflected back at her in infinite repetition. "I want to believe in the beauty." "Then that's what we'll create." Ethan moved to the sound system, his movements sure and purposeful. "Your mother wants to see you dance, really dance. But I want something more than that. I want to see you tell a story that only you can tell." Victoria stepped closer, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "What kind of story?" Ethan's fingers hovered over the controls, his eyes distant with memory. Every dancer has a signature piece, something that captures the essence of who they are, what they've survived, what they've learned. For Emma, it was Claire de Lune. For me, it was a piece I choreographed called Phoenix Rising, after Sarah and I lost our first pregnancy. Clara's breath caught. "You lost a baby." "We tried for 3 years before Emma came along. Each loss felt like dying a little bit more." Ethan's voice was soft, but there was steel beneath the gentleness. The piece was about transformation through pain, about discovering that sometimes breaking apart is the only way to become who you're meant to be. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than strategy or corporate maneuvering. This man understood loss in all its forms, the sudden catastrophic kind that came with accidents and fires, and the slow grinding kind that came with dreams deferred and hearts that refused to heal according to schedule. "What would Clara's story be?" Victoria asked. Ethan looked at Clara with the intensity of someone seeing not just who she was, but who she could become. "That's not for me to decide. Clara, what do you want the world to know about you?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair as she considered the question. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but carried the weight of 18 months of suppressed truth. "I want them to know that I'm not broken. That what happened to me wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a different chapter." She looked up at Ethan, then at her mother, her eyes blazing with determination. "I want them to know that love is stronger than fear, that hope is stronger than despair, and that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the places where we've been shattered." Ethan smiled, and for the first time since the fire, it reached his eyes. "Then that's the story we'll tell." He moved to the sound system, scrolling through options with the focused attention of a master craftsman selecting his tools. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a piece that began with a single piano note hanging in the air like a question waiting for an answer. This is Metamorphosis by Max Richter. It starts in darkness, in uncertainty, but it builds into something transcendent, something that speaks to the power of transformation. He turned to Clara, his expression serious. But it's going to require everything you have. Physical strength, emotional courage, the willingness to be vulnerable in front of people who might not understand what they're seeing. Clara straightened in her wheelchair, every line of her body radiating determination. I'm ready. No, Ethan said gently. You're not. Not yet. But you will be. For the next hour, Ethan worked with Clara on what he called foundation movement, the basic vocabulary of expression that would allow her to tell her story through gesture, posture, and the subtle language of the body that spoke louder than words. He taught her to use her arms not just as appendages, but as extensions of her soul. He showed her how to make her spine a column of strength, even while seated, how to turn her head in ways that conveyed everything from defiance to vulnerability to triumph. Victoria watched from the sidelines, her phone in hand, to record everything, but found herself forgetting about documentation as she became absorbed in the transformation taking place before her eyes. This wasn't physical therapy or medical treatment. This was alchemy, the mysterious process by which pain became art, limitation became liberation, and a wounded child became something approaching divine. Feel the music in your chest first, Ethan instructed, moving behind Clara's wheelchair and placing his hand gently on her shoulders. Let it settle in your heart before you try to express it with your body. The movement comes from emotion, not from technique. Clara closed her eyes, her breathing deep and measured as the haunting melody filled the mirrored space. When she began to move, it was with a fluidity that defied her physical constraints. Her arms rose and fell like waves. Her fingers traced patterns in the air that seemed to capture the very essence of longing and hope. Beautiful, Ethan murmured. Now add your story. Show me the moment when everything changed. Clara's movements shifted, becoming sharper, more angular. Her face contorted with remembered pain, her arms wrapping around herself, as if to ward off invisible blows. In the mirrors, her reflection multiplied into an army of girls reliving trauma, each one a testament to the reality of loss. Don't stay there, Ethan said firmly. That's not where your story ends. Show me what you learned in the darkness. Show me how you began to heal. Slowly, Clara's movements began to transform. Her arms opened, reaching toward something unseen but hoped for. Her face lifted toward the lights, and even seated in her wheelchair, she seemed to be soaring. The music swelled around them, and Victoria felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter become something she had never dared to imagine, not a victim of circumstance but a warrior forged in fire. Now, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, show me your strength. Show me the woman you're becoming. Clara's final movements were powerful, decisive. Her arms cut through the air with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra, her entire being radiating the kind of authority that Victoria recognized from her own boardroom victories. In this moment, Clara wasn't a disabled child seeking sympathy. She was a force of nature, demanding recognition. As the music faded to silence, the three of them sat in the aftermath of what felt like a religious experience. Victoria's hands were shaking as she lowered her phone, knowing that she had just recorded something that would change everything. That was... Victoria's voice broke. Clara, that was extraordinary. Clara's cheeks were flushed, her breathing elevated from the exertion, but her eyes were brighter than Victoria had seen them since before the accident. I felt it. I felt like myself again. Ethan moved to kneel beside her wheelchair, his own eyes wet with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in 3 years. You didn't just dance, Clara. You flew. And everyone who sees this is going to understand that you're not someone to be pitied or protected. You're someone to be celebrated. Victoria checked the time on her phone, 6:15 a.m. The board meeting was in less than 2 hours, and she had work to do. But first, she needed to address something that had been building in her chest throughout the morning. Ethan, she said, her voice carrying a vulnerability that few people had ever heard from Victoria Sterling. I owe you an apology. He looked up at her in surprise. For what? For seeing you as a threat instead of a gift. For almost letting my fear rob Clara of this moment, of the chance to remember who she is. Victoria's voice grew stronger, more certain. I've spent 18 months trying to protect her from a world that might hurt her, but I forgot that the world also contains people like you. People who see beauty where others see brokenness. Ethan stood slowly, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Sterling, I need you to understand something. What we just created here, it's not a cure. Clara is still going to face challenges, limitations, moments when the world feels impossible to navigate. This doesn't change her diagnosis. No, Victoria agreed. But it changes how she sees herself. And more importantly, it changes how the world will see her. Clara reached out and took both their hands, her grip strong and sure. It changes how we see each other too. We're not just 3 broken people anymore. We're a family. The word hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and hope. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, not the cold calculation that had driven her for 2 decades, but something warmer, more human. For the first time since Richard had walked out when Clara was 3, citing the pressures of being married to someone more successful than God, Victoria felt like she wasn't fighting alone. At 6:45 a.m., Victoria's assistant Marcus arrived with coffee breakfast and the kind of crisis management expertise that had made him invaluable during the Morrison acquisition. He took one look at the scene, Clara glowing with post-performance euphoria, Ethan radiating the quiet confidence of a master craftsman. Victoria pacing with the electric energy of someone preparing for war and immediately understood that everything had changed. Mrs. Sterling, Marcus said carefully, the board members are arriving early. Mr. Corbett has been in the building since 5 a.m., and he's brought legal counsel. Whatever you're planning, it needs to be bulletproof. Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Marcus, meet Ethan Crawford, Clara's new movement therapist, and the man who's going to help us remind the board why they should never underestimate a Sterling. Marcus's eyes widened as he processed the implications. You're bringing him to the board meeting. I'm bringing both of them, Victoria said, her voice carrying the absolute authority that had made her legendary. Clara and Ethan are going to give those old men a demonstration they'll never forget. Ma'am, with respect, that's incredibly risky. If this goes wrong, we lose everything we never really had in the first place, Victoria interrupted. But if this goes right, we don't just save the company, we transform it into something worth saving. Ethan moved closer to Victoria, his expression serious. Are you sure about this? Once we walk into that room, there's no controlling the narrative. The press will get hold of this story, and Clara will be in the spotlight whether she wants to be or not. Victoria looked at her daughter, seeing not the fragile patient she had been protecting, but the fierce young woman who had just danced her way back to life. Clara, this is your choice. You don't have to do this. We can find another way to fight Corbett. Clara's answer came without hesitation. Mom, for 18 months I've been hiding because I was afraid of what people would think when they saw me. But Ethan just showed me that I'm not something to hide. I'm something to celebrate. If those men in that boardroom think my accident makes you weak, then I want to show them exactly how wrong they are. Victoria felt her heart swell with pride so fierce it was almost painful. Then let's go show them what Sterling women are made of. At 7:30 a.m., the Sterling Industries boardroom was filled with the kind of tension that preceded corporate executions. The long mahogany table gleamed under crystal chandeliers, surrounded by leather chairs that had hosted billion-dollar decisions and empire-ending betrayals. 12 men in identical dark suits sat around the table, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes bright with anticipation. James Corbett sat at the far end of the table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile carrying the confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. At 58, he had spent his entire career waiting for this moment, the chance to topple Victoria Sterling from her throne and claim the empire she had built as his own prize. When the boardroom doors opened and Victoria entered with Clara and Ethan behind her, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria moved with the fluid grace of a predator approaching prey, her black power suit armor for the battle ahead. Clara followed in her wheelchair, her posture perfect, her eyes bright with determination. And Ethan moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. "Gentlemen," Victoria said, her voice carrying easily through the vast room, "I believe you called this meeting to discuss my fitness to lead this company." Corbett's smile widened. "Victoria, we're concerned. The pressure of running a Fortune 500 company while managing your daughter's situation seems to be affecting your judgment." "My judgment," Victoria repeated, her tone dangerously quiet. "And what exactly makes you question my judgment, James?" "Well, for starters, the security footage from last night. You were seen having an emotional confrontation with a member of the janitorial staff over your daughter's inappropriate behavior." Corbett gestured to a large screen at the front of the room. "I think the board deserves to see exactly what kind of judgment you've been exercising." The screen flickered to life, showing grainy security footage of the lobby encounter, Clara in her nightgown, Ethan with his mop, Victoria's arrival, and obvious anger. To those who didn't know the full story, it looked exactly like what Corbett was suggesting. A CEO losing control, a family in crisis, a company leadership in question. "Fascinating," Victoria said, her voice carrying amusement rather than concern. "And what conclusions did you draw from this footage, James? That you're distracted, that your personal problems are affecting your ability to make rational decisions for this company?" Corbett leaned forward, sensing victory. "The board has lost confidence in your leadership, Victoria. We're prepared to call for a vote of no confidence unless you step down voluntarily." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Victoria looked around the table, seeing the faces of men who had served under her leadership for years, who had profited from her vision and strategy, who were now prepared to discard her at the first sign of perceived weakness. "Gentlemen," Victoria said finally, "you're right about one thing. Last night did represent a significant change in my judgment, but not in the way you think." She moved to stand behind Clara's wheelchair, her hands resting gently on her daughter's shoulders. "For 18 months, I've been so focused on protecting my daughter from a world that might hurt her that I forgot to show that same world what an extraordinary person she is. Last night, Ethan Crawford reminded me that my greatest strength as a leader has never been my ability to avoid risks. It's been my ability to recognize potential that others miss." Corbett's confidence wavered slightly. "Victoria, what are you?" "James, you see a distracted CEO and a disabled child, but I see something different." Victoria's voice grew stronger, more commanding. I see a young woman who refuses to let tragedy define her limits. I see a therapeutic approach that could revolutionize how we think about recovery and human potential. And I see a business opportunity that could position Sterling Industries at the forefront of a completely new market. She nodded to Marcus, who began setting up additional equipment at the front of the room. Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Ethan Crawford, former principal dancer with Pacific Northwest Ballet, acclaimed choreographer, and the newest member of our Therapeutic Services division. The board members exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard by this development. Corbett's face was beginning to flush with anger and confusion. Therapeutic Services, one of the board members asked. The fastest growing segment of the healthcare market, Victoria replied smoothly. Movement therapy, adaptive fitness, holistic approaches to recovery and wellness. Industries that Sterling could dominate if we have the vision to see the opportunity. She moved to the front of the room, every inch the CEO who had built an empire through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. But before we discuss market projections and revenue streams, I want you to see something. I want you to understand what's possible when we stop seeing limitations and start seeing potential. The lights dimmed, and the haunting opening notes of Metamorphosis filled the boardroom. Clara moved to the center of the space, her wheelchair gleaming under the soft lighting, her posture perfect despite the dozen pairs of eyes watching her every movement. What happened next was nothing short of magical. Clara began to dance, and in that sterile corporate boardroom surrounded by mahogany and crystal, and the cold mathematics of profit and loss, she created something transcendent. Her movements told the story of loss and recovery of strength, found in unexpected places of beauty that refused to be contained by circumstance. The board members sat transfixed as this 12-year-old girl transformed their understanding of what was possible. Her arms carved through the air with the precision of a master sculptor. Her face radiated the kind of joy that reminded them all of why they had fallen in love with their own children, their own dreams, their own forgotten hopes. Ethan moved around her wheelchair with fluid grace, his own movements supporting and amplifying hers, creating a duet that spoke to the power of partnership, of lifting each other beyond individual limitations. Together they danced a story of transformation that was impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, impossible to see as anything other than extraordinary. As the music swelled to its climax, Clara's movements became more powerful, more assured. In her wheelchair, she looked not like someone constrained by disability, but like someone who had discovered a different kind of flight. Her final gesture, arms raised toward the ceiling face, radiant with triumph, left the entire room in stunned silence. The music faded, but the magic lingered in the air, like incense after prayer. Victoria let the silence stretch for a long moment, before speaking, her voice carrying quiet authority. Gentlemen, that is what happens when we choose to invest in human potential rather than human limitations. That is what Sterling Industries looks like when we remember that our greatest asset isn't our technology or our market share, it's our ability to see possibilities that others miss. James Corbett looked like a man who had just watched his carefully laid plans crumble into dust. Victoria, this is very moving, but it doesn't change the fundamental questions about my what, James? Clara's voice cut through his protest like a blade. The 12-year-old girl who had just danced her way into legend was now fixing him with the kind of stare that had made her mother famous in boardrooms around the world. About my mother's ability to lead, about her judgment, about her fitness to run this company. Clara's voice grew stronger, more commanding. Let me tell you what I see when I look at my mother. I see a woman who built this empire while raising me as a single mother. I see someone who survived a hostile takeover attempt while sitting by my hospital bed for 3 months. I see a leader who just identified a completely new market opportunity in the time it took most of you to drink your morning coffee." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But most importantly, I see someone who taught me that Sterling women don't back down from fights, especially when someone mistakes our love for weakness." The boardroom erupted in murmurs of amazement and approval. Several board members were actually smiling, their earlier skepticism replaced by something approaching awe. The demonstration hadn't just been beautiful. It had been strategically brilliant, transforming Victoria's greatest perceived vulnerability into her most compelling strength. Corbett made one last desperate attempt to salvage his coup. "This is all very theatrical, but we need to focus on practical concerns. The company's financial performance, market position." "James," Victoria interrupted, her voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering sentence, "you're fired." The silence that followed was absolute. "You can't," Corbett began. "I can, and I have." Victoria's smile was ice-cold and absolutely lethal. "You conspired against the company's leadership, attempted to manipulate the board through selective presentation of evidence, and fundamentally misunderstood what makes Sterling Industries successful. Your termination is effective immediately." She looked around the table at the remaining board members. "Anyone else have questions about my fitness to lead this company?" The vote of confidence was unanimous. As the board meeting concluded, and the members filed out their conversations buzzing with excitement about new opportunities and market potential, Victoria found herself alone with Clara and Ethan in the vast boardroom. "Well," she said finally, "that went better than expected." Clara laughed, the sound echoing off the mahogany walls. "Mom, you just turned Corbett's weapon into our victory. That was the most sterling thing I've ever seen." Ethan shook his head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like that. You didn't just save your position, you transformed the entire narrative." Victoria moved to the window, looking out over the Seattle skyline that her empire helped define. "It wasn't just strategy, Ethan. It was truth. Clara showed them something real, something powerful, something that reminded all of us why we fell in love with the idea of human potential in the first place." She turned back to face them, and for the first time in 18 months, Victoria Sterling looked like a woman who had everything she needed. "Now about that therapeutic services division. I think we have some work to do." 6 months later, the grand opening of the Rhythm and Light Center drew crowds that stretched around 3 city blocks. The building itself was a masterpiece of adaptive architecture, glass and steel, that seemed to dance in the Seattle sunlight, with ramps that curved like musical notes, and windows positioned to capture every precious ray of natural light. Above the entrance, carved in elegant script, were the words that had become the center's motto, "Where movement meets magic." Victoria stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office, watching the stream of people entering the building below. Families with disabled children, elderly couples seeking joy and movement, professional dancers recovering from injury, and countless others who had heard whispers of miracles happening within these walls. The Rhythm and Light Center had become more than a business venture. It had become a pilgrimage site for anyone seeking to rediscover what a thought or body would do rather than dwelling on what it couldn't. "Nervous." Ethan's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and understanding. Victoria turned, still marveling at how much had changed in half a year. The man approaching her bore little resemblance to the broken janitor she had encountered that night in the marble lobby. Ethan Crawford had reclaimed his identity as one of the most innovative movement therapists in the country, but more than that, he had reclaimed his capacity for joy. His eyes, once haunted by loss, now sparkled with the satisfaction of purpose rediscovered. Terrified, Victoria admitted, allowing herself a vulnerability she had learned to embrace. We're about to show the world something that defies every conventional understanding of limitation and possibility. What if they don't understand? What if they think we're selling false hope? Ethan moved to stand beside her, his presence both calming and energizing. Then they'll be missing the point entirely. We're not selling hope, Victoria. We're offering truth, the truth that human potential can't be measured by traditional metrics, that beauty exists in forms most people never think to look for. Their relationship had evolved with the careful precision of a perfectly choreographed dance. What had begun as a professional partnership forged in crisis had deepened into something neither had expected to find again: love that was mature, tested, built on shared understanding of loss and mutual respect for strength. They moved around each other with the fluid grace of people who had learned to anticipate each other's needs, to offer support without being asked to challenge each other toward greater heights, without fear of causing harm. "The reporters are here," Marcus announced from the doorway, his excitement barely contained. In the months since the board meeting that had become legendary in corporate circles, Marcus had transformed from a corporate assistant into something approaching a movement evangelist. CNN, NBC, the Seattle Times, and about 6 international outlets I can't pronounce. They're all asking for Clara. Victoria smiled, feeling the familiar surge of pride that accompanied any mention of her daughter. "Where is she?" "Studio 3, working with the new students." "You know how she is. She says the opening ceremony can wait, but the kids can't." The Rhythm and Light Center housed 12 specialized studios, each designed for different aspects of adaptive movement therapy. Studio 3 had become Clara's domain, the space where she worked with children and adolescents who were learning to navigate the world with new limitations. At 13 now, Clara had grown into her role as both student and teacher, showing younger children that wheelchairs could be instruments of grace rather than symbols of constraint. Victoria and Ethan made their way through the center's corridors, past studios where music spilled out in waves of possibility. In Studio 1, a group of elderly participants were rediscovering the joy of movement through chair-based dance that had them laughing like teenagers. Studio 2 housed the professional program, where former dancers and athletes worked to rebuild careers that had seemed finished. Studio 4 was devoted to neurological rehabilitation, where stroke survivors and traumatic brain injury patients were rewriting the textbooks on recovery through rhythm and movement. But it was Studio 3 that held the heart of the center's mission. Victoria paused in the doorway, watching her daughter work with a group of 6 children, ages 8 to 14, all dealing with various physical challenges. Clara moved between them with the confidence of someone who had found her calling her wheelchair an extension of her grace rather than a limitation on her movement. "Remember Marcus?" Clara was saying to a 10-year-old boy with cerebral palsy. "Your body speaks a different language than everyone else's, but that doesn't make it less beautiful. It makes it uniquely yours. Show me your story." The boy, who had been self-conscious and withdrawn when he arrived 3 weeks ago, began to move with increasing confidence. His movements were different from traditional dance, less controlled, more organic, but they carried an emotional honesty that brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. "That's it," Clara encouraged. "That's your truth. That's your magic." Ethan leaned close to Victoria, his voice soft with wonder. "She's extraordinary. You know that, right? What she's doing here, it's not just therapy. It's transformation on a cellular level." Victoria nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Clara had not only found her own way back to wholeness, she had become a guide for others seeking the same journey. The girl who had been convinced she was broken had become a healer, teaching others that wholeness came not from perfection, but from the courage to embrace their authentic selves. Mrs. Sterling, a young woman with a CNN press badge, approached tentatively. I'm Sarah Chen. We spoke about the interview. Victoria straightened, shifting into the professional mode that had served her well through countless media appearances. But this was different. This wasn't about corporate earnings or market strategy. This was about sharing something sacred, something that could change how the world thought about human potential. Of course. But first I want you to see something. Victoria led the growing group of reporters and camera crews into Studio 3, where Clara was now leading her students in what had become known as the Unity Dance, a piece Ethan had choreographed specifically for mixed ability groups. The children moved together, some in wheelchairs, some using walkers, some with prosthetics, some with conditions that made their movements unpredictable. But together they created something transcendent, a visual symphony that spoke to the power of inclusion, of finding beauty in diversity, of refusing to let difference become division. The reporters stood transfixed, their cameras capturing something that would be replayed around the world within hours. But Victoria noticed that many of them had stopped filming, too absorbed in the moment to remember their professional obligations. This was the power of what Clara and Ethan had created. It bypassed cynicism and intellectual analysis, speaking directly to the heart, with a message too pure to be denied. As the dance concluded, Clara turned to address the assembled media with the poise of someone far beyond her 13 years. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Rhythm and Light Center. I'm Clara Sterling, and these are my fellow dancers. We want to show you that there's no such thing as a broken body, only bodies that tell different stories. The questions came in a flood, but Clara fielded them with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. Yes, she had been paralyzed in a riding accident. Yes, she had struggled with depression and despair. But no, she didn't consider herself inspirational. She considered herself lucky to have found people who saw her potential rather than her limitations. The real inspiration, Clara said, gesturing toward Ethan, comes from people like Mr. Crawford, who lost everything and still found the courage to believe in magic again. Who taught me that healing isn't about getting back to who you were, it's about becoming who you were always meant to be. Ethan stepped forward, his hand finding Clara's shoulder in a gesture that had become natural over the months of working together. Clara has taught me something equally important, that sometimes the teacher needs to become the student, and sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the opportunity to discover their own strength. One of the reporters, a middle-aged man from the Seattle Times, raised his hand. Mr. Crawford, there are critics who say this type of therapy offers false hope to families dealing with permanent disabilities. How do you respond to that? Ethan's expression grew serious, thoughtful. I respond by inviting those critics to spend a day here to watch what happens when people are given permission to explore what their bodies can do rather than being told what they can't do. We're not promising miracles, we're offering possibility. And sometimes, possibility is miracle enough. Victoria stepped closer to the group, feeling the weight of the moment. The Rhythm and Light Center represents more than just a new approach to therapy. It represents a fundamental shift in how we think about human potential, about the relationship between limitation and possibility, about what it means to be whole. She gestured around the studio where children were still moving to music only they could hear. 6 months ago, my daughter was convinced she was broken. Today, she's teaching other children that they're magnificent exactly as they are. That transformation didn't happen through medicine or surgery or any traditional intervention. It happened through the radical act of being seen, being valued, being invited to dance. The CNN reporter leaned forward, her professional interest clearly personal now. Mrs. Sterling, this represents a dramatic departure from Sterling Industries' traditional focus. Was this difficult to justify to shareholders? Victoria's smile was sharp, predatory. Clara Sterling Industries stock has increased 37% since we announced the Rhythm and Light initiative. We're not just doing well by doing good, we're proving that investing in human potential is the most profitable strategy of all. She paused, her expression softening. But more than that, we're proving that business can be a force for transformation, not just transaction. The Rhythm and Light Center employs 47 people, serves over 300 clients, and has a waiting list that stretches 6 months. We're not just successful, we're necessary. As the formal interviews concluded and the media crews began packing their equipment, Victoria found herself alone with Clara and Ethan in the emptying studio. The three of them had become a family in the truest sense, not bound by blood or legal obligation, but by choice, by shared values, by love that had been tested and proven strong. "How do you think that went?" Clara asked, her confidence wavering slightly in the aftermath of intense public scrutiny. "I think," Ethan said, settling into a chair beside her wheelchair, "that you just showed the world what courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite being afraid." Victoria joined them, creating a small circle in the center of the studio that had become sacred space for so many breakthrough moments. "Clara, do you remember what you said to me that night in the lobby? About helping each other remember who we used to be?" Clara nodded, her eyes bright with memory. "I think we did something better than that. I think we helped each other become who we were always meant to be." The afternoon sun streamed through the studio windows, painting geometric patterns across the polished floor. In a few hours, the official opening ceremony would begin. Speeches from dignitaries, performances by professional adaptive dance companies, a formal ribbon cutting that would mark the center's transition from dream to reality. But this moment, this quiet communion between three people who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to create light together, felt more significant than any public celebration. "There's something I want to show you both," Ethan said, his voice carrying a note of barely contained excitement. He moved to the sound system, his fingers dancing across the controls with familiar precision. "I've been working on something special for tonight. A piece that tells our story, all of our stories." The music that filled the studio was unlike anything they had heard before. It began with a single piano note, the same note that had opened Metamorphosis that morning in the executive gym 6 months ago. But this piece was richer, more complex, weaving together themes of loss and discovery, isolation and connection, fear and courage. It was autobiography set to music, the story of three broken people who had chosen to heal together. "It's called Three Voices," Ethan explained as the opening movement swelled around them. "It starts with Sarah and Emma with the life I lost and the man I used to be. Then it moves to the silence, the years of numbness and self-imposed exile." The music shifted, becoming sparse, haunting. Victoria could hear the loneliness in it, the way grief could hollow out a person until only echoes remained. "But then," Ethan continued, his voice thick with emotion, "it finds a new voice. Clara's voice. Young, clear, refusing to be silenced by circumstance. A new melody emerged, bright and determined, weaving through the darker themes with the persistence of hope. It was Clara's musical signature, complex enough to honor her intelligence, strong enough to reflect her courage, beautiful enough to capture her essential spirit. "And finally," Ethan said, looking directly at Victoria, "it finds the third voice, the mother, the protector, the woman who learned that love isn't about control, it's about trust." Victoria's musical theme joined the composition, regal but warm, powerful but nurturing. The three melodies danced around each other, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in creative tension, always in relationship. It was their story told in the universal language of music, a sonic representation of the family they had chosen to become. "Tonight," Ethan said, as the piece reached its crescendo, "we're going to dance to this together. The three of us telling our story, showing the world what's possible when broken people choose to heal in community rather than isolation." Clara's eyes were bright with tears. "All three of us together." "If you want to," Ethan said gently. "It's your choice, Clara. It's always your choice." Victoria felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent 2 decades commanding boardrooms, facing down hostile takeovers, navigating corporate warfare with the calm precision of a seasoned general. But the thought of dancing, actually dancing, in front of hundreds of people terrified her in a way that no business challenge ever had. "Mom," Clara said softly, "are you okay?" Victoria looked at her daughter, seeing not the fragile patient she had spent 18 months protecting, but the fierce young woman who had just fielded questions from international media with the skill of a diplomat. Clara had found her courage. She had claimed her space in the world, and now she was asking her mother to do the same. "I don't know how to dance," Victoria admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's smile was gentle understanding. "Victoria, you've been dancing your entire life. Every board meeting, every negotiation, every moment when you've had to think on your feet and adapt to changing circumstances, that's all dancing is. Moving with rhythm, responding to music, finding grace under pressure. But this is different. This is—" Victoria struggled to find words for the vulnerability that dancing would require, the exposure of moving her body, not for function, but for expression. "This is honest," Clara finished. "Mom, you've taught me that Sterling women don't back down from challenges. Are you going to start now?" Victoria looked around the studio, seeing it not as a business venture or a therapeutic facility, but as a sanctuary where impossible things became possible. In this space, children with cerebral palsy discovered grace. Stroke survivors found their rhythm again. Professional dancers rebuilt careers that had seemed finished, and a broken janitor had remembered how to believe in magic. "Okay," she said finally, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Yes, let's dance." The remaining hours before the opening ceremony passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Victoria worked with Ethan and Clara to learn the basic movements of 3 voices, discovering that her body held more music than she had ever suspected. The choreography was elegant in its simplicity, 3 figures moving in relationship, supporting each other, celebrating the unique gifts each brought to their shared story. As evening approached and guests began arriving for the ceremony, Victoria found herself in her office staring at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the Ice Queen who had built an empire through sheer force of will. This woman's eyes held warmth. Her posture suggested openness rather than defense. Her entire being radiated the kind of contentment that came from alignment between values and actions. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. Clara entered, transformed for the evening's ceremony. She wore a dress of midnight blue that made her look older, more sophisticated, but her eyes still held the bright determination that had become her signature. "The guests are arriving," Clara said. "Are you ready?" Victoria turned from the window, feeling a calmness that surprised her. "You know what I think I am." They made their way through the center's corridors toward the main performance space, passing studios where the evening's performers were making final preparations. The building hummed with anticipation, with the electric energy that preceded moments of significance. The performance space itself had been transformed for the evening. 500 seats surrounded a circular stage, creating an intimate amphitheater that would allow every guest to feel connected to the performances. The lighting was warm, inviting, designed to showcase movement rather than merely illuminate it. Victoria took her place backstage with Clara and Ethan, watching through a gap in the curtains as the audience settled into their seats. She recognized faces from the corporate world, from Seattle society, from the disability advocacy community. Politicians sat beside physical therapists. Celebrities shared rows with families whose children attended the center's programs. It was exactly the kind of diverse gathering that the Rhythm and Light Center represented, a space where artificial boundaries dissolved in favor of shared humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice filled the space. Welcome to the grand opening of the Rhythm and Light Center. Tonight, we celebrate not just a new facility, but a new understanding of human potential, of the relationship between limitation and possibility, of what it means to move through the world with grace and purpose. The first performances showcased the center's various programs: children's adaptive dance, neurological rehabilitation, through movement, professional adaptive athletics. Each piece told a story of transformation of people who had refused to let circumstance define their capabilities. The audience was riveted, many openly weeping at the beauty of what they were witnessing. But it was the final performance that would be remembered long after the applause faded. As the lights dimmed and the opening notes of three voices began to fill the space, Victoria felt a calmness settle over her. This was their moment, their chance to show the world what they had discovered together, what was possible when love overcame fear, when hope proved stronger than despair. Clara entered first, her wheelchair gleaming under the stage lights. She moved with the confidence of someone who had found her, calling her arms, painting poetry in the air, her entire being radiating the joy of someone fully alive in their own skin. The audience was transfixed by her grace, by the way she transformed her wheelchair from medical equipment into an instrument of art. Ethan joined her from stage left, his movements a perfect complement to hers. The broken man who had once mopped floors at Sterling Tower was gone, replaced by an artist in full command of his gifts. He moved around Clara's wheelchair like a planet orbiting its sun, their dance a conversation conducted in the language of movement and music. And then Victoria entered. She had never performed before, had never moved her body for anything other than function and efficiency. But as the music swelled around her and she saw Clara and Ethan creating magic together, something unlocked inside her chest. She began to move not as a CEO or a boardroom strategist, but as a woman, a mother, a human being, claiming her right to express joy through movement. The three of them danced together in the circular space, their individual stories weaving together to create something larger than any of them could achieve alone. Victoria discovered that her body held more music than she had ever imagined, that grace was not about perfection, but about honesty, that vulnerability could be a source of strength rather than weakness. The audience was completely silent, absorbed in witnessing something unprecedented: a billionaire CEO, her disabled daughter, and a former janitor who had lost everything creating art together, in defiance of every conventional understanding of limitation and possibility. As the music reached its climax, the three dancers moved into their final formation, Clara at the center, Victoria and Ethan flanking her, all three reaching toward the lights above, as if they could capture the stars themselves. In that moment, they were not CEO and employee, not mother and daughter, not teacher and student. They were simply three human beings who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to create light together. The silence that followed their final pose stretched for what felt like eternity. Then the applause began, not the polite appreciation of a society gathering, but the kind of thunderous ovation reserved for moments that change everything. People rose to their feet as one, their applause mixing with tears, and shouted words of appreciation and awe. But for Victoria, Clara, and Ethan, the noise faded into background. They remained in their final pose, breathing hard from exertion, their hearts racing with the aftermath of artistic expression. In that moment, they were complete not because they had achieved perfection, but because they had achieved truth. As they finally broke their pose and moved to acknowledge the audience's appreciation, Clara reached out and took both their hands. "I love you both," she said, her voice just audible over the continuing applause. "Thank you for teaching me that family isn't about blood. It's about choosing to dance together even when the music stops." Victoria squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling tears streaming down her face without shame. "Thank you for teaching me that love isn't about protection. It's about trust. Trust that the people we care about are strong enough to handle whatever comes, brave enough to keep dancing even when they're afraid." Ethan lifted their joined hands toward the audience, his own tears catching the stage lights. "Thank you both for teaching me that healing doesn't mean forgetting what we've lost. It means learning to carry our losses with grace while remaining open to new love, new music, new possibilities for magic." As they finally left the stage, the three of them walked together toward the center's main lobby, where a reception was already in full swing. But before they joined the celebration, Victoria stopped them in a quiet corridor, away from the crowds and cameras and congratulations. "I want you both to know something," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had built an empire, but also the tenderness that had healed a family. 6 months ago, I thought my job was to protect Clara from a world that might not understand her. But you both taught me something infinitely more valuable, that the world needs Clara exactly as she is, that her difference isn't a limitation to be managed, but a gift to be celebrated. She looked at Ethan, seeing not the broken man she had once threatened to destroy, but the healer who had saved them all. "And Ethan, you taught me that love isn't about avoiding loss. It's about having the courage to risk everything again when the right people come into your life." Clara reached up from her wheelchair and pulled both adults into an embrace that felt like coming home. "We're going to be okay, aren't we, all of us together?" "More than okay," Victoria said, holding her daughter and the man who had become their family's cornerstone. "We're going to be extraordinary." As they finally joined the reception, moving through crowds of well-wishers and supporters, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a simple question, "Would you like to dance?" asked by a broken man to a wounded girl in an empty marble lobby. But it had become something far more significant, a testament to the power of hope over despair, of love over fear, of the human spirit's refusal to be contained by circumstance. The Rhythm and Light Center would go on to change countless lives, to redefine approaches to disability and recovery, to prove that beauty existed in forms most people never thought to look for. Clara would become a global advocate for adaptive arts, speaking at conferences around the world about the power of inclusion and the necessity of seeing potential rather than limitation. Ethan would reclaim his position as one of the most innovative choreographers of his generation, creating works that pushed the boundaries of what dance could be and who could participate in its magic. But for Clara Sterling, billionaire empire builder mother, the greatest transformation had been the simplest one. She had learned to dance, not just with her body, but with life itself, with uncertainty and possibility, with the beautiful chaos that comes from loving people enough to trust them with their own journeys. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Victoria found herself once again in Studio 3, the space where so much healing had taken place. Clara and Ethan were there too, the three of them drawn together by the magnetic pull of shared experience and mutual affection. So what happens now? Clara asked, her voice soft in the quiet space. Victoria looked around the studio, seeing not just a room, but a sanctuary, a place where impossible things became possible on a daily basis. Now we keep dancing, she said simply. We keep believing in magic. We keep seeing potential where others see limitation. We keep choosing love over fear. She moved to the sound system and selected a piece of music, something soft and hopeful, a melody that spoke of new beginnings and endless possibilities. As the music filled the space, the three of them began to move together, not in formal choreography, but in the natural rhythm of people who had learned to trust each other completely. They danced in the quiet studio as Seattle slept around them, three people who had found each other in darkness and chosen to create light together. They danced as daughter and mother, as teacher and student, as partners in the ongoing work of healing and hope. They danced as family, not bound by blood or obligation, but by choice, by love, by the shared understanding that some bonds transcend circumstance and limitation. Outside, the city hummed with its usual nighttime energy. But inside the Rhythm and Light Center in Studio 3, where miracles happened daily, three dancers moved to music only they could hear, creating something beautiful in a world that had forgotten how to believe in magic. And in that movement, in that choice to keep dancing, even when the world told them they were broken, they proved that some things are stronger than circumstance, deeper than loss, more enduring than any limitation imposed by fate or fear. Love, hope, the refusal to let tragedy have the final word. These were the forces that had brought them together, that had transformed a janitor into a healer, a disabled girl into a teacher, a corporate titan into a mother who knew how to dance. And as they moved together in the quiet studio, their reflections multiplied infinitely in the surrounding mirrors. They created something that would echo far beyond this moment, this building, this single point in time. They created proof that healing is possible, that families can be chosen, that sometimes the most broken people become the most beautiful when they finally find the courage to dance. The music played on, and they danced with it. Three voices joined in harmony, three hearts beating to the same rhythm. Three souls who had discovered that magic wasn't about having everything. It was about sharing what you had with people brave enough to dance in the dark until the light returned. And the light had returned. In their movements, in their laughter, in their love for each other. The light had returned, and it would never go out again.